Good to see so many friends coming. Welcome, everybody. Okay, well, I think I'm going to get started and let people just trickle in. So welcome, everyone. I am Paige Ruane. I'm a co-founder of Partners for Climate Action and will be facilitating this morning coffee series session. At PCA, we work to foster meaningful ecological and climate action within the bioregion of the Hudson River estuary watershed. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of a bioregion, it's an area defined by characteristics of the natural environment rather than human-made divisions such as municipal or county boundaries. And then bioregionalism is an ecological and cultural philosophy that emphasizes the importance of defining human activities and societies in relation to natural ecosystems as well. So our work here at PCA is done through grant making, technical support to nonprofits and municipalities, programs, and educational offerings like this morning coffee series. And this is all made possible by donations, so we encourage you to contribute if you can. Here's some logistics for today. This session is being recorded and will be shared with all of you and posted on our website. And we ask that you please mute yourselves during the session, but feel free to submit questions and comments in the chat. If you follow the chat, please also like the questions you want to hear answered by using the thumbs up button next to the question, and we'll prioritize those with the most likes. So our topic today, I'm really excited about this session. Our topic is the myth of apathy regarding climate and ecology. With the ecological crisis so dire, why does it seem like many individuals, businesses, and governments do not seem to be altering their behaviors that contribute to the problem? And how can we truly support each other, our friends, fellow neighbors, citizens, colleagues, and leaders to make a change? Well, our guest today, Dr. Renée Lertzman, has thought deeply on the subject of how we can catalyze meaningful change with the help of evidence-based approaches she has developed. They are grounded in public health, clinical psychology, and neuroscience, and I'm thrilled and honored to welcome her today. Renée is a researcher, advisor, and strategist who turns relational psychology into an accessible tool to change our approach to the planetary crisis. So for 20 years, she's been partnering with leaders, teams, startups, companies, and organizations, both in the private and public sectors. And she's been helping people to move beyond the usual strategies of urging and cajoling others, which is often ineffective. Instead, she'll share tips on finding common grounds and ways to catalyze action where it seemed previously impossible. In 2018, she founded Project InsideOut, which offers tools and resources to this effect. And she can be found at reneelertzman.com and projectinsideout.net, which is going to be put in the chat. So in full transparency, I want to share that I'm a former therapist, and in preparing for this session, I realized that despite my psychology training, I too have fallen into classic unhelpful behaviors, which when I've attempted to motivate people, kind of acting like Chicken Little, the sky was falling. And Renée will describe these pitfalls. So she's already helped me to perceive more constructive approaches and forms of dialogue and leadership. Our new training and grants program, Funding Futures, will spark community conversations. And it's based on a belief that deep listening undergirds successful climate action. So it was especially helpful to find Renée's guidance now. And thank you to my friend Stefan Schneider for recommending her work to me. I feel that her approach can be a game changer for all of us who are working in our communities. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Renée. Renée, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Very, very excited to be joining you all. I love working with organizations such as yours. I will be sharing why I feel this is kind of where the action is. I think a lot of us are starting to feel that way increasingly. These kinds of very special communities of practice, these organizations that are showing up as hubs that provide people with tools and resources, but also connection is incredibly vital. So thank you for having me. I want to start by inviting everyone who's here to just take a moment and allow ourselves to arrive and just land in this space. We have, about 55 minutes together. And I think it's really important and a way of kind of, enabling ourselves to really have the most of this time together is to just let ourselves land and arrive. So if you want to just take literally a moment, if you want, you can close your eyes or you can turn your camera off, but I really recommend that you take just a few moments to just sort of feel yourself here. And you can take a couple of nice deep breaths and just turning your attention inward just for a moment. So it's almost like imagining you're just kind of swiveling your attention from being outward inward. And just take a moment. You could even put your hand on your heart, on your chest, and just sort of feel yourself in this moment. And notice how you're feeling and how you're doing in your body and your mind and your sensations. Just all we're doing is just checking in and noticing what brought you here into this session. And what has brought you to do this work, to be engaged and involved? What is the quality of that? And just noticing and taking stock of the fact that we are gathered together here in this virtual space. Many of you are in the same region. And just noticing what it's like to be in a group, in a container. And let your system register that. And when you're ready, you can transition back into the room, into the screen. And just notice in one moment, it's about a minute, what, if anything, might have shifted or changed for you. And remembering that this is something we can do at any time. At any time, we can bring ourselves into presence. And it often doesn't take much. So I want to begin with that invitation that we have enormous resources available to us at any given time to show up and do this work. So I want to also invite any of you who feel like it, if you want to share in the chat, how are you feeling? What's like a feeling word that describes where you're at right now? Could be about what's happening, how it feels like to be here, what you're feeling more generally. How are you feeling right now? Heartsick, overwhelmed, jittery, confused, scattered but optimistic, always on the edge of being close to tearing. Okay, see some affirmation. Nice to have a safe harbor. So just notice, what it's like to hear how we're all doing and feeling, and keep it coming. And just noticing what it's like to have your feelings reflected and affirmed. So I've got anxiety, soft and open, unease. So there's quite a spectrum here. And I want to really invite us to hold that space, for the spectrum. And often it's not one thing or the other. I like to see, the conjunctions of, I'm feeling anxious, but also excited and inspired to be here. I'm feeling tired and energized. that we can hold these incredibly multiple and sometimes conflicting feelings and experiences at the same time. And that's actually a really key piece of what I want to share with you and talk with you about as we explore ways of having productive interactions about the existential threats that we are facing as a community, as a nation, as a global community. That one of the keys to really orienting to having interactions with people around these issues is recognizing that often there are multiple feelings and experiences, and that these issues, these crises, these topics can evoke a lot of strong feelings, often anxiety or overwhelm, and that humans have ways and strategies of managing that, right? And so I believe that it's actually baseline literacy, anyone working on these issues to understand how to navigate these strong feelings and emotions that many of us are having, including those who you perceive as not caring at all. Hence the phrase, the myth of apathy. So I'm going to talk for a bit about that concept and how I came to it. And I'm going to guide us through in the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to guide us through a bit of a kind of a little bit of my story and offering you some perspectives and some practices that you can start incorporating, um, and hopefully set you up to feel a bit more equipped moving forward. And I really appreciate the continued shares of where you're at and how you're feeling. It's actually really healthy. So I'm really, really glad to see that. Okay, I'm going to transition now into my slides. I want to just first acknowledge before I do that, that I was reminded in the beginning of this call when we were chatting that I have quite a special relationship with the Hudson Valley region. And I kind of forget that sometimes, that when I was 19, I set off from California to New York, was a really big deal. And I ended up like doing a work exchange at Omega Institute and camping, living in a tent for the summer in 1989. And so from that time on, I've just had a very, very special feeling about the region. I've spent time in Cold Spring and Garrison and so forth, but it's part of my story. It's part of my lineage. So really excited to be with you. Okay, here we go. All right. So I like to start all of my sessions with this invitation from someone named Amy Edmondson. She's a professor at Harvard. She's very well known kind of in the leadership, organizational development world. She has a new book out called Right, Kind of Wrong, about our relationship with failure. And I've learned a lot from her. She's a colleague and a friend. And she reminds us that it's hard to learn if you already know, which sounds very obvious, but I feel like what we're talking about here is to some degree unlearning, and also recognizing that for us to grow and evolve, how we approach these issues does require a certain element of humility. And I really appreciated Paige naming that and showing that humility. That is actually leadership today. Like the ability to say, I don't know, or I'm learning, or I've gotten some things wrong. That's actually the place we want to start when we are in a growth kind of mindset. So really appreciate you acknowledging that. And I also want to situate this work in the context of what I call existential change management, which means that I'm just playing on the term change management because I learned only in the past 10 years or so that there's a whole field called, quote, change management in the business and kind of organizational world. And the more I learned about it, I realized, well, wait a minute, that's what I kind of have been doing my whole career. And ended up working with Google very closely for several years, and was used like as a change management consultant. And I suddenly started putting these dots together around work on climate change and work on what's called change management. It's really about recognizing that we are in a moment, and we have been, of really needing to look at how do humans process and engage with change, and oftentimes complex and difficult change. And so I'm inviting this frame to just help situate the work we're doing. Um, and I also like to invoke this particular quote from a colleague of mine, Ashley Consulo. She is a researcher and professor in Canada, and she ended up publishing this really powerful piece in the Lancet in July 2020. And I highly recommend, you can find it online, can share the link later. But the reframe we're in right now, because this is what she's doing, is a bit of a reframe, where she's saying that it's possible that our feelings of ecological grief and anxiety, although uncomfortable, are in fact the crucible through which humanity must pass to harness the energy and conviction needed for the life-saving changes now required. So just kind of take that in for a moment and notice how that's a reframe. And the reframe is, instead of this being like feelings or experiences that are, we want to get away from, or are negative or a downer or whatever, that in actuality there's a lot of energy in our experience and our feelings. And the question is truly, how do we channel that energy? How do we work with it? How do we process our emotional responses in such a way that allows us to be effective and healthy and regulated in the sense of our nervous systems? And I want to also just invite us to consider that we're in a real transition time right now, of a lot of like taking stock, of like looking at ourselves and really looking at, how am I showing up in this work, right? And I see this as a really powerful, really potent time that we're in. So along those lines, I want to share, Paige invited me to share a little bit about kind of how I came to this, and what my story is a little bit more to ground us. And it started for me really when I was young. I grew up in the peninsula, in Silicon, what's called now Silicon Valley, in Los Altos, Palo Alto area. And from a young age, I was really preoccupied with, for whatever reason, with big issues. And, at the time, nuclear war, nuclear threat was like hanging over our heads in the 80s. And I really sought refuge in nature. And I also sought refuge in psychotherapy. So I started seeing a therapist when I was a teenager at age 15. So by the time I got to college, which was at University of California, Santa Cruz, I came in really feeling certain I was going to be a psychologist, a therapist. And then I ended up just happening into taking an environmental studies course, and it completely destabilized my entire life and perspective, because I was literally going across this bridge. If any of you know, the UCSC campus, has this bridge, and it connects these parts of the campus and these disciplines. And I was literally going between my psychology classes, where there's no mention at the time of, environment, climate change, how we got into this crisis, and then going over to environmental studies, environmental science. And at the time, very little acknowledgement, one, of what it means as a human to really come to terms with what is happening, and also how did we get here. And this was in the late 1980s. So this was also a time when the field of what's called deep ecology was starting to really take hold. This was in a time of the very beginnings of what's called eco-psychology was starting to happen. It was a very dynamic time. But my story, my origin story really kind of begins here, which was bridging these worlds. And for me, it was like totally, I couldn't not think of these as connected. And I ended up creating my own major and all this stuff, but it was really the question of, what does it mean, frankly, to be alive at this time? And what does it mean for humans to really respond? And what are the conditions that enable us to respond? That was really the driving question even back then. So I then left my studies and ended up taking a field study course, which was a 2-month backpacking trip in the Sierras, kind of Northern California. And what happened in that backpacking trip was not only, and I talk about this in my TED Talk very briefly, but basically the real, yes, being in nature and immersed in nature was profound. And the experience of literally just being in a small group of people, being able to talk about how we were feeling, and not just what we're feeling, but like what we're thinking and sense making. And, we were reading and writing all that deep ecology, it was an eco philosophy and religion course. And so just that experience of being heard and hearing others, I noticed really increased my sense of agency and optimism. And I felt like really emboldened from that experience to go out and actually do something. And so that experience became almost like a template for me. And fast forward, I started getting really into researching the psychological kind of research world, and specifically psychoanalysis, which, is more of a thing in your world and we're in California. So I can come out and say I was very inspired by psychoanalytic research. And I ended up going and living in the UK for several years and training with psychoanalytic researchers. And I ended up meeting this particular individual who's a real pioneer, Hannah Siegel. Most people don't know who she is outside of psychoanalysis. But, I went to meet with her and, she said, we have a very specific contribution to make. And she basically conveyed that therapists and people who have psychological knowledge are cognizant of exactly these mechanisms that we are seeing writ large in the world, denial and projection and splitting and all of that. And, her point was we should be able to contribute something, right? And I really feel strongly about that. I feel that those who understand these dynamics need to contribute and need to partner with organizations, with climate scientists. We need to be partnering 10x, 100x more than we currently are. So fast forward, I come back. There's a lot to say here, but we don't have that much time. I came back from the UK via New York, by the way. I spent a few years doing a PhD in New York City at the Graduate Center, left, went to the UK, ended up finishing my PhD over there, training in this field, that the psychosocial field I was just mentioning. And then I ended up in a training called motivational interviewing, MI. And motivational interviewing is a methodology that was created in the public health sector specifically for clinicians and specifically for people in public health who are trying to help people change. And I was like, first of all, I was the only one in the room, who wasn't a clinician. And I couldn't believe how everything they were talking about described what everyone I know and myself was dealing with who's working on climate change, which is a tendency to try to yell, what I call yelling, telling, or selling, that we're trying to push. And what they introduced me to was the concept of guiding. And it turns out that this work is the most evidence-based approach to behavior change. It is the most evidence-based approach that works. Now, you might be wondering, if it's the most evidence-based approach, why are we not using it more? That is my question for you and for us to consider. Why are we not using this more? So I took it and ran with it. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna run with this. And what is guiding? What is guiding? Guiding is a collaborative, person-centered approach to help people explore and resolve ambivalence towards change. ultimately strengthening their motivation and empowering them to make their own decisions. It's collaborative and person-centered. It's about evoking versus telling, yelling, and selling. And it's about engaging with people's ambivalence, which is to say, mixed feelings, conflicts. And I believe that the essence of guiding, right, which is itself a synthesis of humanistic psychology and other things that we know about. These two guys, these two white men did not create all of this from scratch. It itself is a process of distilling and synthesizing into a very simple framework that almost anyone can use. Almost anyone can pick this up. And so the key takeaway I want to land with this guiding approach as it relates to your work is that this is my take, is that you want the person or the people you are working with to have all the good lines, not you. And by that I mean guiding is about evoking people to give voice to their own interest, curiosity, volition for change, versus you saying, this is why it's important, this is what you need to do, and this is why you should change. So those are like the good lines, right? And from a clinician point of view, it's like, how do you create the conditions so that you don't have all those good lines, the others have those? And by the way, I use this work with it can be applied in campaign strategy, messaging. It doesn't have to be an interpersonal dynamic where you're evoking people's reflection. All right, so let me keep an eye on the time because okay. I'm going to move along. So guiding is really key as far as I'm concerned for how successful we are. And as far as my journey, on this, I've been in all these places. I personally am fall prey to a lot of these tendencies. So as I started developing this body of work, I started identifying these kind of styles of change making that we tend to feel like we're either cheerleaders and feeling like we have to keep people really motivated and upbeat. We're writers, we're like righteous, and we're basically saying why it's the right thing to do. Or we're educators and we're educating and informing. And all of these have a certain value and some importance, right? These are qualities. But when we're defaulting into like this kind of mode, it's more about us and our anxiety and how we're managing it than about being actually relational, being like tuned in to how are others feeling and how are others doing. And so really what we're wanting to do is to evolve our style to be more like the guide. And the guide really, the key to guiding is knowing how to evoke, right? How to prompt, how to elicit. And specifically evoke and elicit these 3 A's about what are you anxious about, where's your ambivalence, and where are you deeply aspiring. These are my 3 A's. So along the line, I left academia in 2010, and I started getting commissions to do work. And one of those was with the Alliance for Climate Education, which back then it was a different kind of organization, and it was funded by the Skoll Foundation and Skoll Global Threats Fund. And they commissioned a really powerful project about helping young people lead climate conversations with adults in their lives, with parents and adults. And so I pitched to them. I kind of did an intervention because they were about to go out and just tell young people, like, have the talk, with your parents. And I was like, that sounds like a terrible idea. You don't want to send people into an environment where they could be attacked or shut down, or you know what I mean? And I just wanted to like look at how do we equip people. So I designed this kind of lab I called the Climate Psych Lab and ran it around the country with a bunch of high school students. And then it became even more of a project, and you can also find the report online. But what's really cool is that they ended up creating this video based on my work on these climate psych labs and based on motivational interviewing. So I'm going to show you this video. It's a few minutes long, and it's an illustration of this guiding approach I'm talking about, and just keeping in mind that it was designed for high school students, and it was sent to thousands of them on their cell phones. And then they went and had the talk, and then they were able to respond via survey on the cell phone how it went, and all of that is in this report. All right, so I'm going to show this video.
Talking about climate change can be tough. I mean, it's not like something you can just casually bring up in conversation, but it's such a big, important topic. We can't just ignore it. And while you can't fix climate change all by yourself, you do have the power to affect the people in your life. So let's talk more about climate change. Here's how. First, think about all the things you want to say about climate change, and don't say them. Really. You see, if you just start going off on how bad climate change is, people are probably going to shut down. They may feel attacked and put up their guard. It doesn't matter how eloquent your words are. If the other person's not listening, there's no point. So here's the secret to talking about climate change. Listen. Listen to the other person. I know it sounds weird, but it's the most important part. You may think the goal is to convince the other person of your perspective, but that's going about it all wrong. The goal is just to have an actual conversation, and that only happens when people listen. So, how do you start? First of all, don't ambush people. Get permission first. If they're busy, no need to force it. Just try again another time. Distractions make talking hard, so it's okay to ask to shut devices off. Once you have their attention, start with a question about climate change. Remember to make it about them, not you. Ask about their thoughts and their perspective. When they start speaking, you have one job: just listen. Resist any urge to respond right away. And whatever you do, don't interrupt. This might be the hardest part, especially if you have strong feelings or if the other person is saying something that you disagree with. But trust me on this. Just listen and be open to what they're saying. Now, if the other person doesn't say much, that doesn't mean you can go, okay, they're done, my turn. It's not your turn until you learn something about the other person. So encourage them to say more by asking follow-up questions. Ask about personal experiences. No need to go into science or politics. Reflect back what you hear them say. Repeating and referring to their words lets them know that you are listening, that you care about their point of view. This makes them feel valued and safe. When you earn their trust, they will be more willing to open up and listen to you. So after they've shared their perspective, then ask if you can tell them about yours. Okay, now it's your turn. What will you say? Remember, the point is not to convince the other person of anything. If you try to do that, they may become defensive and stop listening. Just share what you personally think about climate change. You may not be a climate expert, but you are the expert on yourself. So tell your story. When did you start caring about climate change? What worries you the most? After you're done talking, ask what they think. Bring it back to them. And you guessed it, listen. That's what a conversation is, a two-way exchange of ideas. Go back and forth for as long as it feels right. Learn from one another. At the end, thank them for talking and say what you learned from them. This is important. Ending on a positive note makes it more likely that this conversation will happen again. You see, one little chat may not change anyone's life, but it opens the door to more climate conversations in the future. And that's how you build trust. Get others caring about climate change and make a long-term impact. You may be surprised how much you learn in the process too. So, what are you waiting for? Talk to someone about climate change. It may be one of the most important things you do.
Okay. So, there's a lot in that video to unpack, and it's pretty cool because they managed to consolidate a lot. But one of the most important aspects of this approach that is sort of touched on in the video is about reflection. It's about the ability to reflect back what you hear the other person say. And I'm saying that because it's been really drilled into me from my mentors in this field, that if we were to, I've had people say, if there's one thing, like people really understand and practice, it's reflection. It's basically learning how to tolerate and manage your own reactivity, your own feelings, like what's coming up for you when you're talking with people, and to be able to say, so this is something that you know, care about, but at the same time, you're feeling like there's not much point anywhere. It's not like, it's a way of affirming without needing to correct them or, you know, anything like that. And once we establish that reflection, it really sets the conditions for really going deeper with people. Okay. So moving along here, I'm not going to unpack this right now, but this is a quadrant that I ended up creating as well, which just kind of outlines the tendencies we have as far as our theories of change. And so we can send a link for you to learn more about this. But basically, as Paige mentioned, I received a grant from the KR Foundation in 2018 to start creating some tools and resources, and I called it Project InsideOut. And it's still out there. And the basic premise of Project InsideOut was to create some tools and resources that are really about being a guide for anyone who could use. And we have these 5 guiding principles: attune, reveal what's real and true, but compassionately, convening people like we're doing here, like this organization is doing, equipping, which is what you're doing, giving people tools and resources, and sustaining. So really fostering momentum and really like ensuring that we create conditions for people to feel co-ownership, co-design, that it's not just the climate org over here driving everything, but it's really about creating a movement and inclusion. And so, you know, to wrap up this kind of piece here so we can have time for discussion, I wanted to offer just a few very, very simple practices along the lines of, you know, what this key is to having more productive interactions. And I want to tie this to the theme of the myth of apathy, just to kind of close the loop on that theme. The premise here and why we're looking at these methods and these practices is that apathy is a defense mechanism. Like, I don't believe people are legitimately apathetic about the state of the world or the future of the world. But when there's anxiety, you know, and that could be anxiety about my identity or you know, my agency or feeling helpless or whatever, we create all kinds of mechanisms to manage that. And it can show up as a dismissal or a disconnect or a tuning out. And so the way to cut through that is by demonstrating curiosity and really approaching our interactions with a lot more emotional intelligence and what I would call a trauma-informed approach, which is, you know, recognizing these are really difficult topics. And I'm not talking about just the impact of climate change. I'm talking about the proposed solutions are very anxiety provoking for a lot of people. Energy transition, food system change, water issues is all very anxiety provoking. And so, you know, that's why we're looking at these different ways of like engaging, right? And so ask, offer, ask is one practice that my trainer shared with me that I like to put forward because it's so easy, which is that it's this AOA. So you begin with asking a question. You know, what do you know? What have you experienced? What are you feeling? So you always ask first, what do you already know about this? Are you open to having this interaction? That kind of thing. What do you care about? What's most top of mind for you right now? And then there's the offer. Are you open to, you know, I'd like to share with you some information about this issue. So you communicate as an offering. And then finally you complete this with a follow-up. Ask, what do you think? Tell me more. Help me understand. Did I get this right? What am I missing? How can I help? So this approach of guiding is not just about listening. It's not just about like being passive and letting people talk. You're actually guiding towards a direction. You're guiding towards an action plan. You're creating an action plan, but the way to do it is that you're you're creating the conditions for people to kind of follow and come along with you. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm really happy to respond to any reflections, thoughts, and questions that might be arising.
Thank you so much, Renee. This is wonderful. I just want to first say, I think it's so interesting. We do these morning coffees. We've done several of them, and often there will be a lot of chatter in the chat. And there's none right now. I feel that people are actually deeply listening to you right now, and with good reason, because you brought us into a really thoughtful space, and what you're sharing is so useful. And I just want to reflect back a couple of things that really struck me. I think it's so wonderful that you asked, what are the conditions that enable us to respond? What an important question that I have not been asking. And I think many of us just think, as you're pointing out, we go along and do what we think is needed. It also really struck me that you were saying, and by the way, now please everyone put some questions in the chat for Renee while I'm talking. I think it's also so key that you talked about how we need to manage our own reactivity when we're talking to someone, and to be noticing that is very helpful for me to hear. And we notice we're losing people, but we don't quite, when we're trying to convince them, but we don't know quite how to change course. And I also want to say, like, everyone responds to what, like, we know in our bones that what you're saying is truth. I do. And people respond to it, but we forget to give it. Like, we ourselves respond to someone listening to us and being empathic, but we forget to give it.
Right.
So anyway, thank you so much. This is incredibly meaningful, and thank you for sharing your story. And now we'll open it up for questions. So some questions that a lot of people wanted to hear. So let's see, from Annie Christian. She says, thanks so much, Renee. I developed a climate change resource with information from a Yale project on climate communication. My strongest memories from that project was finding common ground, such as health and future generations. I'm really grateful for the tools you've shared here, more like framing than specific types of priorities or issues. So thank you. Okay, that's
I feel like I just want to acknowledge that. So I have a background in communications and a master's in it, and have worked with a lot of the climate comms people and research. And I feel like what's been missing are a few things. One is the inner management piece that you just mentioned, Paige. Like, we can't talk about how to communicate without talking about how we manage and our own internal reactivity. And so we look at our actual feelings and attitudes about those we're communicating with. Like, I learned this when I was doing my interviews in Green Bay, Wisconsin, with conservatives. I noticed that I was feeling sometimes frustrated, or sometimes like, impatient, or like, come on, like, just get it, or whatever. And it's really important to have a healthy relationship with those feelings, because they will come out however we end up communicating, and they come out through a lot of climate campaigning unconsciously. So there's that piece. The other piece about climate comms that I think gets missed, including my colleagues who I really respect, is that it's not just about talking about values. It's not only, and that's what I'm really wanting to convey with the 3 A's in that script. It's not just we care about future generation or whatever. It's about acknowledging ambivalence. Like, I feel really conflicted because part of me wants to be on the right side of life and history, and the other part is really scared about letting go of some things that I've become. I feel like I don't know how I would live without, right? Like, we have to build that capacity to name and acknowledge these really tough dilemmas and not label it like, well, then you just obviously don't care enough. If you cared more, you wouldn't care if there was a windmill in front of your view of the lake. You would want, and it's like, that's not being attuned. So that's the piece that I'm really wanting to bring forward here, is how do we really create space to acknowledge people's often irrational, but, you know, um, honest feelings about what's going on.
It's great that you're normalizing that, so that we don't feel shame about those feelings that come up.
Mm-hmm.
And I really also was struck by something that you said in one of your talks, which was when you are with people in this kind of ambivalence, then you allow them to find their own solutions, and actually
Absolutely.
they find the solutions quickly. Like it happens much
Totally.
quicker than you would realize.
It's
So
like that. And here's the thing, when we hear ourselves give voice to our ambivalence and what we are willing to do, we're way more likely to like integrate it and believe it than if it's someone else saying it. And so this is why the superpower of guiding is about how we evoke and ask questions. It's largely 80% that and 20% information sharing, right? I mean, it's just the neuroscience of learning. It's not that radical, but it's just a matter of how do we apply it. And I feel like the reason why it's so hard to apply this is because it's very emotional and the stakes are very, very high. And that's why I'm really intrigued by how this was created in a clinical setting where it's like life and death often. Like if you don't stop doing this, you will kill yourself or you will harm people in your life. Like stakes are high. And so they've had to come up with this method to like how do you navigate when you just want to shake someone and just say, "Don't you realize what we're doing? Like, come on." And so this is an ongoing practice for all of us.
yeah, that's great. Okay, great. So I'll get to some of the questions here. Regarding, this is from Jen Pickard, regarding guiding the AOA practice, what happens when the person you are trying to talk to does not engage at all, no matter how many ways you ask and approach with curiosity and
Then that's not a conversation.
Mhm.
There's nowhere to go.
Right, right.
So, and I'm not someone who will ever say, let's just ignore all the deniers over there and, like, I think that we should stay open. But if there's no conversation, there's no conversation.
Yeah,
But I do believe that we often are not doing what we can to, you know, everyone likes to talk about themselves. Everyone likes to be heard. Everyone wants to feel validated. So, quite honestly, if there's no conversation, it suggests that maybe that's not happening.
great. Thank you. Okay, a question from Vanessa. It seems like this is about relationship building too. It's not just one conversation, but building trust over time. How many conversations might it take?
Um, it's like how long is a piece of string? I mean, it really depends on what the context is. But to your point, Paige, a lot can happen very quickly. I think we have this fantasy like, I mean, I've been doing this 20 years, so I've heard every pushback, right? Everyone says we don't have time for this. We don't have time. Well, do we have time not to take the time to do what is going to actually work? And so, I love hearing stories. There's a video online. I don't know if you Google Mr. Smith and motivational interviewing, there's an MI clinician who tells this incredible story about 10 years with this one patient, Mr. Smith, and he's like smoking, and then she learns MI, and then he comes in on that visit on year 10, and she's like, "So, Mr. Smith, would you be open to, and then all of a sudden there's an action plan."
Wow.
So my point is this can happen pretty quickly, but sometimes it does take time. So it's a
Gotcha.
relational approach.
Mhm. Great.
Okay.
Yeah, this is from Amy Daly, and she asks, we are embarking on a resilience plan. How do you recommend we assure our residents in disadvantaged communities that their voices are important to the process, specifically in the identification of critical assets and hazards?
So there's a lot to unpack there. Um, and this is, by the way, a lot of what I do. So I advise and consult with organizations and projects to implement these guiding principles. And what you're talking about here is a tuning. So also, if you go on the Project Inside Out website, there's those 5 guiding principles. It's up right now. I don't know how much longer that website will be up because one, it needs funding. So if anyone's super energized by this, you can contact me to keep it alive. And two, it's I'm about to do a book, and so the book's going to come out. So I'm going to we'll see what happens with all that material being out there right now, but it's out there now. And Attune is about how do you gather insights about your people. So there's a variety of ways of doing that. There's using really like surveys, there's listening, conversations. What I like to do always, and we didn't do it here, but what I usually do is I do some initial surveying or listening, and then once we're all together as a group, I share the distillation of those insights anonymized. And what that does is it really gives the group or the community like a mirroring and a reflection and feeling attuned. Then from there, you go into reveal, which is let's talk about what's actually really going on here and what we need to do about it. But with that attunement piece has to come first.
Great. And I so appreciate that, because that's exactly, those are the kinds of things we're going to be helping people to do in the Funding Futures program. Great. Well, I want to respect people's time, so we're going to close now. And Renee, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm really, really grateful you could join us. I feel that your work is so important. It's really the work that underlies all of ours, those of us working in the climate and ecological space. So thank you so much. And I want to just have a few quick announcements. So if you think this work could support yours, Renee does consulting with all kinds of groups and organizations. So if you can be in touch with her about that, as she said, and if this work inspires you, you can check out her Project InsideOut website and support her in offering these resources to others by giving a donation. And you can contact her through her website. There's a contact, a place where you can contact her there that's obvious. And applications are now open for our new training and grant program, as we've mentioned, Funding Futures, on our grants page at climateactionhv.org. It will offer communities grants and training to identify and fund environmental priorities. And the request for proposals closes May 23rd. So also the next morning coffee series will be on Thursday, May 15th at 8:30 a.m. Tracy Brown, the president of Riverkeeper, will join us. Someone who Renee, or that organization Renee was working with. Her topic will be drought and deluge, what the future of water looks like for the Hudson Valley. So mark your calendars for May 15th at 8:30 a.m. It's Thursday, and we'll send an invitation shortly. And we will follow up with links to Renee's work and information about Funding Futures, along with a copy of today's recording. So thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you all have a great day.